This is Federalist 40, Part 5. We are in the middle of paragraph 15. Let me repeat the last sentence because Madison refers to, actually quotes from the Declaration of Independence. He says, they must have reflected. He's talking about the people who attended the convention in Philadelphia. They must have reflected that in all great changes of established governments, forms ought to give way to substance, that a rigid adherence in such cases to the former would render nominal and nugatory the transcendent and precious right of the people to abolish or alter their governments as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. So he quotes here directly from the Declaration of Independence. Since it is impossible for the people spontaneously and universally to move in concert towards their object, and it is therefore essential that such changes be instituted by some informal and unauthorized propositions made by some patriotic and respectable citizen or number of citizens. So he says, just like when we had the revolution and we had to declare our independence, they didn't make it like a referendum and go to everybody and say, we are about to write a Declaration of Independence. Should we do it or not? He says, no. In these kinds of circumstances where something urgent needs to be done, some patriotic citizens get together and on behalf of the community do things that's best for the community. He says that's the same thing that's happened here. When we got together in Philadelphia, we had to think of the long-term interest of the people of all of the states of the country. They must have recollected that it was by this irregular and assumed privilege of proposing to the people plans for their safety and happiness that the states were first united against the danger with which they were threatened by their ancient government, that committees and congresses were formed for concentrating their efforts and defending their rights. He's talking about the different revolutionary committees that got together in different states right when the revolution kicked off. Because at first they had to, these committees would do a lot of the revolutionary work at first in different states till they wrote the constitutions for the states. And that conventions were elected in several states for establishing the constitutions under which they are now governed. Nor could it have been forgotten that no little ill-timed scruples, no zeal for adhering to ordinary forms were anywhere seen except in those who wished to indulge under these masks their secret enmity to the substance contended for. They must have borne in mind that as the plan to be framed and proposed was to be submitted to the people themselves, the disapprobation of this supreme authority would destroy it forever. Its approbation blot out antecedent errors and irregularities. It might even have occurred to them that where a disposition to cavil prevailed, their neglect to execute the degree of power vested in them, and still more their recommendations of any measure whatever not warranted by their commission, would not less excite animadversion than a recommendation at once of a measure fully commensurate to the national exigencies. So he says in these extraordinary times, you have to take extraordinary steps to make sure that the safety of people is not in danger. So these wise people that gathered together in the Philadelphia Convention did the same thing that during the revolutionary times our revolutionary congresses and committees did. They didn't want to sacrifice the people's happiness, so they declared independence. They didn't put it as a referendum. They just said this is what's best and did it. So he says the same thing. These delegates in Philadelphia have done for you what you would have done if you had been given the chance to make something good for the future of your country and your countrymen and for the future generations. Because we'll see here, he's going to, in this paragraph, mention again something that's good for mankind, not just for Americans. All right, I'll continue with the paragraph. Had the convention, under all these impressions and in the midst of all these considerations, instead of exercising a manly confidence in their country, by whose confidence they had been so peculiarly distinguished, and of pointing out a system capable, in their judgment, of securing its happiness, taken the cold and sullen resolutions of disappointing its ardent hopes, of sacrificing substance to forms, of committing the dearest interests of their country to the uncertainties of delay and the hazards of events, let me ask the man who can raise his mind to one elevated conception, who can awaken in his bosom one patriotic emotion, what judgment ought to have been pronounced by the impartial world, by friends of mankind, by every virtuous citizen, on the conduct and character of this assembly. Had they not done what they did, then everybody would have said almost, everyone would have looked at him with a degree of disgust and shame. Said this was an opportunity where you could do something for your happiness of your people and mankind, and you didn't do it. Or, if there be a man whose propensity to condemn is susceptible of no control, let me then ask what sentence he has in reserve for the 12 states who usurped the power of sending deputies to the convention, a body utterly unknown to their constitutions, for Congress who recommended the appointment of this body, equally unknown to the Confederation, and for the state of New York in particular, which first urged and then complied with this unauthorized interposition. So he's telling the people of New York who are reading these articles, these Federalist Papers first, he says, we were one of the first people to encourage the Congress to send a resolution to all the states to send delegates to Philadelphia. How can we be the same people that are now criticizing this thing more than the others, more than any of the others? So he says this is crazy. But that the objectors may be disarmed at every pretext, it shall be granted for a moment that the convention were neither authorized by their commission nor justified by circumstances in proposing a constitution for the country. Does it follow that the Constitution ought, for that reason alone, to be rejected? If, according to the noble precept, it be lawful to accept good advice even from an enemy, shall we set the ignoble example of refusing such advice even when it's offered by our friends? The prudent inquiry in all cases ought surely to be not so much from whom the advice comes, or whether the advice be good. So he says, even they say if there's a good advice, even if it comes from your enemy, should consider it, sometimes accept it. He says, now this great advice, this new constitution, has been proposed by the dearest friends of this country, by some patriotic people. Are we not fools if we reject it? The sum of what has been here advanced and proved is that the charge against the convention of exceeding their powers, except in one instance little urged by the objectors, has no foundation to support it. That if they had exceeded their powers, they were not only warranted, but required as the confidential servants of their country, by the circumstances in which they were placed to exercise the liberty which they assumed, and that finally, if they had violated both their powers and their obligations in proposing a constitution, this ought nevertheless to be embraced if it be calculated to accomplish the views and happiness of the people of America. How far this charter is due to the Constitution is the subject under investigation.